holding this event because there was a little story around here, around the Twin Cities, that a news station did called Pointergate, and the society, along with the Twin Cities chapters of the National Association of Black Journalists and the Asian American Journalists Association, we released a statement expressing deep concern over the way KSTP reported the story. And since then, they've not only doubled down, but they've tripled down. It was very important for us to do that because one of the core missions of SPJ is to stimulate high standards in ethical behavior. I do think we live in very interesting times because, now more than ever with the internet, with social media, it's changing the whole dynamic, and it's much harder for journalists to do stories that do not meet high standards, and kind of hide behind that. So I think it's very good that we did that. We stand behind that, but even more importantly, it's good to carry that forward and have a discussion, of that in the community to discuss, how can we do better in the future. So, I'm very happy that we have this together tonight with a distinguished panel. Just to make a quick extra plug for the organization, if now more than ever it's important to be an SPJ member, please go to www.spj.org and click Join SPJ on the top and join. We'd really appreciate it. But I'm going to now introduce Jonathan Kieling, Director of Interactive Properties at Public Radio International and President-elect of our chapter this year, who will carry us forward. Thanks a lot, Jonathan.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, or good evening, everyone. Sorry. Welcome to the MNSPJ panel on Pointergate. What happened and where do we go from here? Our panel is co-sponsored by the Twin Cities chapter of the National Association of Black Journalists, like Chris said, as well as the Twin Cities chapter of the Asian American Journalists Association, as well as the Silha Center for the Study of Media Ethics and Law, and the Minnesota Journalism Center here at the U of M. I'm joined here on the stage by panelist Duchesne Drew, Managing Editor for Operations at the Star Tribune, Anthony Newby, Executive Director of Minnesota Neighborhoods Organizing for Change, as well as in the empty chair, Jane Kirtley, the Director of the Silha Center, who was called away briefly at the last minute but will be joining us just a little bit later. KSTP, I'd like to note here, including reporter Jay Calls, news director Lindsay Radford, owner Stanley Hubbard, and the station's attorneys, all declined our repeated request to join us here on the panel. However, Stanley Hubbard did write and release a 5-page letter to the Society that we'll reference several times throughout the event because I think it's important that their perspective is heard, as is the community's and our distinguished panelists. Tonight we'll have an event in 2 parts. First, I'll ask our panelists a series of questions that I hope will open up the issue and give you new things to think about on this very controversial topic. Then I'll open the floor up to all of you for your questions for the panelists. But more about then. For now, I'm going to ask Duchesne and Anthony to give us very, very brief introductions of themselves and their positions in this community. Duchesne?
Hey everyone, thanks for coming out tonight. So as Jonathan said, I'm the Managing Editor for Operations at the Star Trib, and that incorporates a bunch of things, including recruitment and training and some community outreach efforts. And I'm a former chapter president for SPJ as well, locally. And I wish we were all doing something else tonight, but we're here because we have some important matters to discuss. I came to Minnesota 21 years ago, initially as a summer intern at the Star Tribune, and have made a life and a career here practicing journalism. And the story that we're going to talk about tonight, actually a couple of them because there was a follow-up, is not journalism at its best and not KSTP at its best. And I think it's worth talking about how stories like this take on a life of their own and shape in I think bad ways discussions in the community. And maybe some good ones because we're going to have hopefully a more enlightened conversation tonight than was taking place in that newsroom.
Anthony.
So I'm Anthony Newby. I'm the executive director of a community group called Neighborhoods Organizing for Change. We work throughout the metro area. We're a member-based organization. We work in under-resourced neighborhoods And we work mostly in the intersection of race, the economy, and public policy. And we're also the organization from which Pointergate emerged and sprouted. And we're happy to say we played a big role in the fight back in the narrative and sort of helping to push public opinion, sway public opinion, and at least provide some context that has sparked a national conversation around race and journalism and what is the intersection of the two. And if I could just take one moment, because KSTP didn't do this in their story. Nevelle Gordon is here. He's a human being with a face. It was blurred out in the KSTP piece, but Nevelle, would you mind standing up? And so at least everybody can know where this story originated. And again, unlike KSTP, he's here today and is happy to.
I was looking forward to seeing you.
He was. But I'm happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation and looking forward to the discussion.
Well, that's great. I'm really glad to have you. And before we jump into questions, I will just point out that this panel is being live streamed. So when we get to questions and answers, there will be microphones in the aisles. But in the meantime, we're very glad that you're here. And we also want to say hello to everyone who's watching this on the live stream because we're glad you've chosen to tune in as well. Anthony, I want to start with you because you are intimately involved in this story. Through your work with Novell and just through your work in the community of North Minneapolis. So, excuse me, I was hoping you could tell me a little bit about the events, the door knocking that was going on that led up to this, and then what this story has meant for your organization.
Yeah, so some background on before KSTP did the story, we were part of, this story was part of an election cycle. And part of our work is civic engagement and doing our best to engage the community, particularly communities of color, around the election and the need to participate. And as part of that, we knocked on over 55,000 doors, had 20,000 community conversations, and ultimately increased voter turnout in parts of North Minneapolis where, frankly, Novell spent the most time at the doors. So this was the context from which the story emerged. More specifically, there was some arrests of our Canvas folks that happened as part of this civic engagement effort. As is often the case in communities of color, folks are arrested for low-level offenses or, frankly, harassed oftentimes by police. So we had canvassers who were arrested in parking lots, arrested with clipboards in their hands, stopped and frisked for standing in a group of 2 or 3 or more, trying to turn out the vote, essentially. Novell, frankly, was arrested in a Cub Foods parking lot for holding a clipboard and having conversations with folks and trying to encourage them to vote. He was detained, is probably a more accurate description, and released. And the charges have since been dropped or in the process of being dropped, Becky. Just got dropped today, because there was nothing to charge them with, frankly. So this was the sort of fabric by which the Canvas team decided to invite the mayor and the police chief into the office. And folks said, they should have a firsthand look at what our folks are experiencing every day. We think they're probably allies. We should give them a chance to come to the office. And so we hosted an event where both the mayor and the chief agreed to canvass for a few hours. Novell went out with the mayor. By all accounts, they had a great time. We sent a videographer out to document it. They came back, talked and debriefed about all the good work that they did and all the folks that they met. So we were quite surprised to find out some days later that suddenly a notorious gang member, allegedly, was in a gang with the mayor. I guess we didn't have any context for how that could happen, but there was Jake Holes with an email to the mayor that was forwarded on to us with this allegation and the desire to do a story. So we sort of harnessed the energy, and the rest became Pointergate.
Thanks, Anthony. And I should point out here that we also invited Mayor Hodges to join us here on the panel tonight, and she referred us to the statement that she issued a couple days after this broke out, and said that they appreciated the invite but wouldn't be able to join us tonight. Duchesne, I want to turn to you for a bit of a journalism question. KSTP asserts that their story is based on information from informed opinions from multiple knowledgeable law enforcement sources. And I think you and I would both agree that reporters frequently use the views of sources to hold public officials' feet to the fire.
Every day.
But what's different about this case?
Well, on its face, if you look at the way the lead is, only on 5, and the headline that ran when you look through online saying that the mayor was, basically flashing gang signs. Does anyone really believe that that's what she was intentionally doing, or not? Because if you don't think she was doing it, I don't know how you have a story to tell. If you think she's pointing, if you think she thinks she's pointing, I think we're done here. Because the reality is this looks like pointing to most people. And it's a gesture that people make all of the time. And while I have no idea what the conversations were like in their newsroom, I know in my newsroom, if we were to go as far as to call the mayor to confirm that whether she was simply pointing or whether there was more to it, unless she said, well, okay, you got me, I'm rolling with the East Side Boys, that's our gang sign, my bad, I don't know how it goes any farther. I mean, I'm being somewhat tongue-in-cheek about it, but she's clearly pointing. And it doesn't take a genius or someone with a degree in anything to be able to tell that, unless you really believe that her intent is different or that she should somehow know. And this is no disrespect to Novell. He's not a household face or a household name. Did any of you guys know who he was before this story broke? She'd probably undergo more criticism for taking a photo with Tom Petters, right, today, than for someone who's out knocking on doors trying to get folks to turn out to vote. And so on its face, it isn't a valid story, and it isn't the kind of story that speaks well of us as a profession or is helpful when we're beginning to talk about very real issues like gang violence, which is really deserving of more coverage and more thoughtful coverage. But this story doesn't begin to get at it.
Well, let me go from there, because that is a question we want to ask. And Anthony, let me turn to you. As we were discussing this panel as a group, and even as we were discussing this panel before everyone got here, one of the things we talked about was how this story could have gone so many different ways that would have been perfectly acceptable. One of those might be the issue of gang violence that Duchesne raised. And certainly more than I, and perhaps more than anyone here, you're working in communities where violence is an issue. Is gang violence an issue in the communities that you see? And how are you all working to address that issue?
So it's a good question. I think the short answer is this story to us never had the substance to really give weight or credibility to a gang-related story. There are lots of things in the community that could be legitimately framed that way. This just wasn't one of them.
Sure.
Novell isn't a gang member, hasn't been a gang member. There's no evidence of any gang activity. That's also true of other folks on our staff. So this was not a story, it could have been a story about re-entry folks or folks who have done some things in the past that they would change, or that they're working to improve their circumstances in life. That could have been a story. Could have been a story about expanding the vote in communities of color. Could have been a story about the police chief and the mayor all in one place in North Minneapolis together from one. There's a million different ways to spin it. There's just no trace of gang activity anywhere to be seen. And I think that's one of the things that's so ironic about this story is of all the things that could have been pulled to try to create a story, that's the most absurd.
I guess the reason why I asked the question is not to imply that there's any traces of gang activity in this story, but to react to one of the things that KSTP has said, which was that gang violence is a real issue. And they point to 11 recent indictments by a U.S. attorney to highlight how it is a real issue. And I'm, irrespective of the characters in this particular story, I'm wondering if you see that as a real issue. I mean, is gang violence a real issue?
I think certainly it is.
Okay.
I think there's legitimate stories to be written about gang violence. There were stories, in fact, written about the DA indictment, and
Yep.
I think the 11 or 13 folks who were arrested, that was a story that some folks wrote. I think Carol Levin and some others wrote a story about that. What's interesting about that story is J. Cole sent an email doing everything he can to nuance the fact that Novell was going to be arrested in that story. So even though he got it wrong in all other cases, keep your eye out because there's a breaking story on Friday, and it's not over yet, and I'm going to be vindicated at the end of the day. And so we have that email, implying that he would be arrested for that charge. So yes, there are legitimate gang stories. This just has never been one of them.
Sure. Stanley Hubbard, in a letter that he wrote to SPJ and that he described to the Columbia Journalism Review as stinging, said that any news organization which is concerned with the news and not with political correctness would run the story that Channel 5 ran. But Duchesne, my understanding is that the Star Tribune and WCCO both were presented with this picture and chose not to run the story. Is that true? And can you speak to that?
I can't speak in great detail because I wasn't involved in that decision, but I can tell you that we get stories pitched to us all the time that don't meet our standards. That's the nature of the business we're in. And it's fine. I'm not suggesting that because we didn't run it, it in and of itself it makes a bad story. There are plenty of stories that other people run that we pass on. This is one example, though, of one where if you just look at it on its face, there are just so many things wrong with it. Novell, if he's a gang member, and I'm not saying you are, how is Amir supposed to know that? Is she supposed to assume that every young black male she encounters walking through North Minneapolis might be, so let's not pose with him? You know, am I safe to pose with because I'm wearing a tie and I'm graying now and no longer a young black male? I mean, what's their standard for deciding that that's a story? Because really what they did, they tried to argue the story was not about Novell and that it was really about the mayor's poor judgment, right? So where is that evidenced? Her poor judgment in taking pictures with people out knocking on doors to encourage folks to go out and vote? That's exactly what mayors ought to be doing. So I don't understand how they take that image and run in that direction with it and then stand behind it. They reached out to the mayor's office and they were told, no, she really is just pointing, which seems like kind of a duh, but go ahead, ask the question, get the answer. You get the answer back and you still run with the story. What's that say?
Mm-hmm. Duchesne, you said something which I think opens up a bigger issue. You said, is the mayor to be expected to not walk through North Minneapolis, or if she does assume that everyone she meets, every black male that she meets could be in a gang? And Anthony, I want to turn the question to you and ask you, what are the stories in North Minneapolis that aren't being told? I mean, this is a media organization that chose to tell this particular narrative. What are the other stories that the media isn't doing a good job telling in our communities of color, our communities of poverty, that exist around the city, around the state?
Wow, that's a long list. We work, again, at the intersection of sort of race, public policy, and the economy, so there's a story to be told about the racial disparity gaps in this state, some of the worst in the nation. And what's the origin? What's driving that? What's fueling that? Unemployment, recidivism rates, public school graduation rates, on and on and on. What is at the heart of this? I think there's a million stories that could be written on what is the source of that. I think, again, the electoral story, there was a million stories that could be told about the good work that was done by folks like Novell to increase voter turnout in a state where voter turnout was down over 5%, and it was up in this ward. I think there's some interesting stuff as part of that story. I think there's a million things that both we need more work on to figure out what are the problems in communities of color in North Minneapolis that are at the heart of these racial disparity gaps that, again, are amongst some of the worst in the nation, and some positive, optimistic stories about folks like Novell or others on our staff, frankly. We have recent African-American college graduates who are brilliant, and there should be stories about that. I think Pointergate in and of itself, I think if you look at how that story originated and how it became viral, it was not an accident. It was lots of hard work, and folks like Becky on our staff, Dennis and Novell, I can name 5, 6, 8 other people who were up around the clock from before the story aired until, it's just now starting to get to a point where we can sort of take a step back and get a breath. There's a million stories that could be written about the origin of that and how did this singular news story become a viral national sensation and the work that this organization did to propel that. And instead, again, we have organizations like KSTP focused on a non-existent story. And it's good that we have rooms like this to really question why is that.
I want to come back to some of those issues that you raised in a minute, but before I do that, Duchesne, earlier we were talking about how you and I can both sit up here and say there are stories that we've either produced or allowed to be produced that we wish we could go back and do differently, or maybe that we ran a correction on at one point. And I think it's worth admitting that most journalists, probably all journalists, have run a correction about something in their day in the business. When does that become necessary? When is it appropriate for a newsroom to apologize? When do they need to make a retraction? And what point is an apology warranted? Explore that for us.
Well, you know, if you turn to A2, the second page of the Star Tribune, I won't say every day, but often, you'll find corrections, clarifications. You know, we think we've got it right in the moment, and then someone calls or emails and says, hey, you know, and it could be something as innocuous as, hey, it's Helen, but I have 2 L's in my name. You got that wrong. And we're supposed to ask, is that Helen, H-E-L-E-N? And at that point, they can say, no, they're 2 L's, right? To something much more significant than that. Like, that's not what I said. Or it's what I said, but it's taken out of context. Here's all of what I said, and here's how the way you framed it really presented what I was saying in a different and sometimes negative or unfair light. We make mistakes all the time. We're human beings. So the fact that you make a mistake in and of itself isn't the problem. You make a lot of them in our business, you lose your job, right? That they have to have some standards. But it's not that you can never make a mistake. You have to be able to have that conversation the next day with the person and correct it. And that means you correct it attached to that story. And obviously, if you're dealing with a broadcast that's already aired, and you see this periodically, probably not as often as we should see it, not just with the KS, but with other broadcast outlets, where they'll go back and say, well, you know, we told you last night, or we told you earlier tonight X, and it's actually Y. That should be just built into the DNA of all news organizations, that when you realize that you've made a mistake, you correct it. It's really, we're here not because they made a mistake, but because they kept holding to it, right? If they had reflected on it and said, gee, you know, we wish we'd done this or that, or you know, here's the tape of the mayor beating somebody into a gang. Look, we have evidence. We wouldn't be here tonight, right? But the reality is that it's the level of arrogance that isn't just about chaos. I think we see that in our business too often. And that's part of why we're here, is I think that it's not healthy for our profession or for our community to have stories of that air and go unchallenged. It's a disservice.
So, Anthony, you talked about the effort your staff and, frankly, your allies, I guess, underwent to turn the conversation on this story. And I want to read you something that Stanley Hubbard wrote in his letter, and I want your reaction. We know that social media is able to control internet conversation on any given topic. And as I am sure you know, much of what appears on the internet lacks credibility. We have read all too many internet messages about our coverage from people, and in many cases bots, who obviously had not seen our coverage or who came to the internet with a predetermined point of view. What do you say to that? What do you say to the notion that this social media conversation lacks credibility and that it comes from a predetermined point of view?
I think it's ironic, first of all, that he's accusing the story of coming from a predetermined point of view. When you read the emails that went to the mayor, it was very, very clear. In fact, I'd like to just read a portion of this, as it gets to this issue of predetermined ideas. This is the email that was sent to the mayor to frame the story. It was sent to the mayor's office with a photo, the now famous pointing photo. It says, Kate, attached is a photo of Mayor Hodges with a known gang member. His name is Neville Gordon. They are both flashing what appear to be gang signs with their hands. Gordon is a member of a North Side gang. He has a long rap sheet, including narcotics, guns, misconduct, and is also a suspect in last weekend's shooting in Brooklyn Center. Still haven't seen any evidence of that. Potential murderer. I would like an on-camera interview with the mayor about this photo to get an explanation. This was not a question. So we've done thousands of news articles. I've never seen a piece that was framed this way in advance of the story. It wasn't a question. These were clear, deliberate statements of fact, and we're supposed to respond to that. So I think it's ironic that we're the ones somehow spinning the story. You know, I won't speak to Mr. Hubbard's. He's going to have to defend this on his own. But I think it does say something when you have somebody who's been very public, very open about his past and his current work, an organization that's been very public and open about it, that they just continue to dig their heels in and insist that they're right. The tidal wave of public opinion has said that this is egregious, that the way this story was framed is egregious. And they continue to say that this reporter was right, I'm right. And this is less about Stanley Hubbard, but it is a statement about systemic racism and, frankly, white supremacy and the nature of how it operates. Is you can have very wealthy, very privileged folks who oftentimes decide it's their narrative, and nobody else, including the internets, is entitled to an opinion because they set the agenda, they set the standards, they set the framing, and everybody else is wrong. Well, we disagree with that.
Let me follow up on something that you said a few minutes ago, that Novell wasn't in the KSTP story. Ultimately, they decided to black out his photo. They took some steps, I think, that they would say to make the story not be about Novell, though some of the emails that have since come out raise questions about that. But one of the things that Mr. Hubbard said was that they reached out through you to try and talk to Novell, and you guys declined that interview on his behalf. Is that true? And could you speak to your thought process in declining that?
Yeah, I can be very deliberate, and I think we've been pretty public about this, but this email to the mayor's office was forwarded to me, and with the caveat sort of, hey, want to have this on your radar screen, we don't know what this is about. Simultaneously, I got an email from Jay Coles. This was the day before the day of the piece that said, it was not related to Novell. It asked, in a very short one-sentence ask, Mr. Newby, where do you get your funding? How much funding do you get specifically from the city of Minneapolis or the state of Minnesota? To which I responded and was happy to respond, none. We're a 501c4 organization, so we get $0 from any municipal or state agency or federal agency. Wonderful was the reply from Jay Coles. That's all I needed. I'll let you know if I need any more help. There was then a text message exchange where he asked, can I talk to Novell directly? To which I then responded after I had read the email, and it was very clear to me that something was off about the framing, not a chance. I want people to understand it's in the context of they did ask me for Novell's phone number, but it was after I was very well aware of the fact that this was clearly a hit piece. We didn't know of what type, but we knew it was a hit piece at that point.
Okay. One of the things, so I work in digital journalism primarily, and one of the things we talk about a lot and wonder about a lot is social media representative of public opinion? And whether you accept that it is or it isn't, is there a point, Duchesne, when you look at the reaction on social media and think there may be something there that we're not seeing?
Well, certainly, and I would hope it wouldn't even take social media. It could take a phone call from someone just articulating how that story reads from where they're sitting, whatever corner they're planted on, right? So in my mind, this isn't about the fact that Jon Stewart tried to shame KSTP. It isn't about The Onion. It isn't about people outside of our community weighing in. It's about the fact that the people who we're all as journalists supposed to be serving, informing, enlightening, a sizable number of them looked at that and said, you know, this is not what we expect of you. This is not what we deserve from you. And I think you have to listen to that. I mean, trust me, we are not a perfect organization. I am not a perfect person. You know, I've had a lot of difficult conversations with people about the quality of our coverage, specific things that they think we should have done differently. Sometimes I agree. Oftentimes I don't. I'm always respectful. I listen. I try to articulate what our positions are, but I don't come into it thinking we couldn't possibly have done anything wrong here. And this was not a breaking news story where something was done in the heat of the moment. This was an enterprise piece they spent several days on. So there was a lot of time for a lot of smart people to say, hey, does something about this just feel kind of fun to you? And even for us, when there have been stories that we've run that weren't done like on turn of a dime, if someone's upon its running said to us, gee, you know, running this that way, this image or this lead or this headline or this element of the story, you know, really struck me in this way, we'll have that conversation. Ideally, we're having that conversation internally before it runs, right. But we don't always catch that stuff. And you have to be able, I think it's a credibility issue and a respect issue, to take that feedback and have it shape both your reactions to the story that's being discussed at the moment, but also have it shape the way you conduct business going forward. It should be something that they are, and that's in some respects the bigger concern, is I have no sense that they wouldn't do the exact same story again.
Duchesne, let me broaden this issue out a little bit, because one of the things that I think is important to remember is that there are questions, I think, that we should ask about journalism broadly that come up from this story. And one of them is about diversity. Diversity in journalism in the Twin Cities, diversity in journalism in general. You're on the board of the National Association of Black Journalists. Do you think more diverse newsrooms, not just KSTP, but more diverse newsrooms across the Twin Cities, across the country, would change the narrative around stories like this?
I think it would likely improve the quality of journalism for a whole host of stories, not just stories like this. And diversity is a tough issue. If you roll back 40 years ago, there weren't that many people who lived here, who were born here, who looked like me, right? And so most of the journalists of color you see working at local newspapers, television, radio stations, most of us are transplants. Many of the white folks are too, for that matter. But the vast majority of people of color working in journalism here are transplants. And it's significant because it means you have to put extra effort into persuading people that they're going to make a life here and make a career here. But that's work that we should be doing, right? And once you have those folks within your room, within your organization, you have to treat them in a way that makes them feel that their voice matters and keep them engaged and growing, and hopefully over time giving them more responsibility to help them be among the folks who are driving what news is what we say it is, right? In my news organization, news is what the journalists in a room decide it is. What gets covered, what doesn't get covered, how it gets covered. That's the words, it's the image, it's the framing. It's what we say it is. And the same is true for every other news outlet in town. So who you have in the room matters greatly. And it can't just be, well, we've got a couple of black guys, we have a couple of Asians or a couple of Latinos. It's also what role do they play in your organization. And it's not easy. I'll tell you, recruiting to the Twin Cities at times can be a challenge, especially when it falls below 10 degrees. But that's not an excuse. It's just, if it's harder work, then you do it. You spend more time on it, right? You put more effort into it. I always jokingly say, I think it is actually harder being black. So what's that mean? You work harder. So if it's harder being an organization trying to recruit people from other parts of the country to persuade them to live here and work here, and it just is, it is. I'm the recruiter for the newsroom. Then you don't whine about the fact that it's harder. You do it. And then once you get them in the room, you work with them to help them grow and take steps so they can help you do a better job of practicing journalism in this community.
Anthony, I'm going to turn this question around on you from the opposite perspective. But before I do, I want to welcome Jane Kirtley to the panel. As I mentioned, was just going to be here a few minutes late. We'll ask some questions for Jane after I ask Anthony this follow-up questions, and then we'll turn to the audience. So I hope you start to think about the questions that you have, and I will lay out just a few ground rules before we get started. But before I do that, Anthony, thinking broadly about the relationship between communities you work with and the media, would you say it's good? Would you say they're covered appropriately? Would you say there's more work to do?
I would say there's a big, broad range. There are folks probably even in this room that have been exceptional in their coverage. Star and Tribune has at times given us exceptional coverage. I'm looking at Bill Sorm with The Uptake, who's done very detailed work with us on various stories. And KFAI, we were just there this weekend with Soul 2's radio. So there's lots of good stuff happening, and there's a whole range, I think, like any industry. of stuff that's not so good. I think, our ask would be, in all the ways that Duchesne has laid out, that the industry do a better job of sort of policing itself. There's a limited amount that we can do on the outside is oftentimes fodder for stories, but there's a lot that journalists and newsrooms can do internally to sort of mediate and regulate what you all do as an industry. And I think when there are cases like this that are true outliers, frankly, this piece could have been produced in 1814 or 1714, as far as we're concerned. And that's not acceptable in other industries. I don't care if you're making widgets, model airplanes, or TV sets. You don't get to go back in time a couple hundred years and decide that you're suddenly setting the standard. They're not. And so I think the ask is that you all do exactly what you're doing and hold each other accountable. When you see outlier pieces like this, don't let it stand. I mean, it's a form of violence, frankly, when a publicly FCC licensed organization like KSTP is allowed to frame a story that criminalizes people with racial undertones and does it on community airwaves and public airwaves. It's a form of violence. And for folks like you all to have taken a position we think is admirable. It's exactly the right thing to do, and that's the thing that leads to, I think, progressive change over time.
Jane, I'll turn to you, and I know you're going to be at a disadvantage for a few minutes as you get caught up with where we've been, but I want to ask you about, your background is in media ethics, the law, et cetera. I want to ask you what you think a news organization's responsibility is in a story like this.
Well, I think the first obligation is to make sure that you're acting independently, to quote from the SPJ Ethics Code. One of the things that has concerned me for a very long time, and I'm not focusing specifically on this story, although I think it could possibly illustrate it, is the tendency of the news media to basically go with the assumption that what law enforcement authorities are telling them is the unvarnished truth. And that includes prosecutors who, in their desire to reassure the public that they found a perpetrator, will haul out somebody and basically as much as convict him in the public eye before there's even been an indictment in some cases, and certainly before there's been a trial. The critical thing for journalists is that they have to be skeptical about this. They are not an arm of the government. They are not a cheerleader for the government, nor should they be an advocate for a special interest group. It's a delicate balance, but the key is that it's absolutely essential that you maintain your editorial independence. And the only way you can do that is by going to multiple sources. I don't have any problem with a news organization getting a tip from any source, but I think to simply rely upon that, to go with the story, to pick up that narrative and basically let it go forward unchallenged is really, to my mind, not the most responsible way to proceed with journalism. We're supposed to be watchdogs of the establishment, of authority, of the government. We're supposed to be watchdogs of everybody, really, and nobody should be taken just as face value. But I think there's a danger in stories like this when the sort of conventional wisdom becomes that if it's somebody who's speaking from a position of authority, we take what they say without questioning. They may be telling the truth, and it may bear out in the long run that that's exactly what the narrative would be, but I would never just accept that from any single source.
So I have one more question for you, and I'm also going to ask it of Duchesne, and that's, do you think organizations should have a policy for responding to public criticism of their work?
You mean an internal policy?
An internal policy to respond to external public criticism of their work.
Well, you know, we used to have here in the state of Minnesota, the Minnesota News Council. There used to be a national news council, and these were places where members of the public could go to and raise concerns about media coverage. Oftentimes media coverage that would not give rise to a legal claim. Something like this story, although I could probably, since I'm a lawyer, could probably come up with some way to come up with a legal basis to challenge it. Ultimately, this is an ethical issue. And I think that one of the wonderful things about the First Amendment is that it means that the government isn't supposed to tell news media what they're supposed to do. The paradox of that is that because the government doesn't tell us what to do, we really have to police ourselves. And so the short answer to your question is I absolutely think that news organizations should have a policy, not only to respond to complaints, but to proactively engage with the public, to invite their participation in the news reporting process, to the news gathering process in cases that are appropriate, and to give them a chance to weigh their concerns and to listen to those concerns carefully. They may not always have merit, but the point is that you increase your credibility if you accept criticism that's well-founded, and if you address criticism that isn't so well-founded, recognize that reasonable people can disagree. But the buzzword these days is transparency, and part of transparency is explaining your thought processes, your editorial processes, and the editorial decisions that you make. They may not still agree with you, but they will at least, I hope, respect you for having gone about this in a principled way.
Duchesne?
Yeah, we get calls all the time from people who think we've got something wrong or omitted something that was important, and that's part of the deal in this business. You have the conversation. If you discover you have actually made a mistake, you want a correction or a clarification. If it's not something that fits into that category, but there's additional information that's of value that maybe fits into a follow-up story, you put it in there. I'm thinking, I sat down got a call from someone I know a few weeks ago about a running story that we've been on, who had a bunch of concerns. And I said, you know what? Let's sit down and talk. And we did a line by line on multiple stories. And what came out on the other side of that was some of the stuff that he thought he'd read, he had not read in our paper. Some of the stuff that he had read that he thought we were saying, we were not saying. Other people were saying it, and we had every right and responsibility to report the fact that those people were saying it. But there was value, I think, in just walking through, and it was multiple stories, walking through the coverage with this person to help him see what was actually written down. And I think it's hard to be the target of a critical story, and in this instance he was. And so, we're not going to undo that. The courage was warranted, but it was an opportunity for me to say, okay, well, here's what you were quoted as saying, or here's what someone else said about you, or here's how this thing was framed. And I think on the other side of it, what he took from it was that we actually hadn't, in that instance, made a mistake. And I was perfectly open to the fact that he would have said, no, that's not what I said. We made a mistake. Then we own that, right? That's part of the deal. I'm not afraid to say I messed up and we'll correct it. That's, in my mind, that allows me to come back to you or others later on and ask more questions. That's part of the deal. And so we don't run from that. We don't think we're perfect. We don't think that because someone's unhappy, we owe them an apology or a correction or a clarification. I'm not saying that everyone gets satisfaction, but we have the conversation. That's part of the deal. And if to be honest with you, if you worked for me and you weren't even willing to have the conversation, we would be in a bad place. You would be in a bad place with me.
Okay. And I think that's a good place to move to questions from the audience. Before I do that, I just want to mention, if you're tweeting about this, the hashtag tonight continues the hashtag that's been used with this discussion throughout, which is Pointergate. We do have two mics, that one will be in each aisle. I ask, because the event is being live streamed tonight, that you do signal that you'd like to ask a question, and one of my two fellow board members with the mics will come to you. A couple ground rules, and I'm just going to read them exactly so that we're all on the same page. No speech making, no bombastic or inflamed rhetoric, and just one question per person until everyone who wants to ask a question has had a chance to ask a question. I hope you'll all respect those rules, and you'll respect me when I remind you to respect those rules, and I hope we can have a very fruitful and informed continuation of the discussion that we've already had. With that, do we have questions from the audience?
Do you want us to introduce ourselves?
Please do introduce yourself.
I'm Linda McDonald. I'm a retired journalist, and I used to run 360 Journalism, which is a program for high school students of color and who are interested in journalism. Isn't part of the problem here that the mayor didn't respond and her office didn't respond? And so talking about the need to check with multiple sources, My understanding is that she was given a day or 2 days' notice on the story and did not respond. And we can debate, I would agree with what the panel's criticism of the story that ran, but didn't she or somebody in her office have an obligation to respond?
I
think the first story.
Duchesne, why don't you speak, and then maybe we'll just go down, because I think there are different pieces of this that each person can answer.
She didn't go on
individually.
camera. The mayor didn't go on camera, but there was in that first story a note that the mayor's spokesperson said that the mayor was just pointing. And I think that's what you see. She's pointing. So it's not that they didn't respond. They just didn't go on camera to say she's just pointing or get drawn into larger conversation about the mayor's gang affiliations. And in my newsroom, the response of the mayor was just pointing probably would have been enough for that particular story, to be honest with you.
Anthony, just...
This is about her intent. It's not about anything other than her intent.
Anthony, in your mind, is this story worse because did this story happen because the mayor didn't answer?
Yeah, I won't speak to what the mayor did or didn't do, and I'm sure she had reasons to respond the way she did. But back to that point, it's very clear in this email evidence that are now public record. You can go to our website and they're public, and you can read. We did a formal request. What's the technical term, Becky? Data practices request, where public officials' emails are public record. So you can read through it and see there, in fact, was plenty of evidence. In fact, the mayor gave context for what she was doing at that event, said, I'm just pointing. And furthermore, if they had, just to further give some background, I had a conversation with the editor. I'll give her name, Ann Wittenberg, who I'm sure is a lovely person. And when I got the email before the story ran, I asked her specifically, do your background research, because it looks to us like a story is going to run that may not be accurate. She said, I will call you back. I'll do some research. She did and called back and said, we're going to run it. So this was not, it's really hard to say it was an error of omission. They got plenty of background info that said, this is not the story that you think it is, and they decided to run it anyway.
Jane, zoom out on this for me. And you may hear me say that to you several times in the rest of this evening. Okay. But when sometimes journalists don't get responses. Does that let them off the hook for the story?
I think it depends on the story. I mean, they're still on the hook. They're even more on the hook, I suppose, if they don't have some kind of response. But of course, there are many reasons that people don't respond. Public officials, I think, have an obligation to respond whenever they possibly can. But there are many times for litigation purposes, liability purposes, privacy purposes, all kinds of reasons that people just don't respond. So if that were the criterion by which we judge whether you can go forward with a story or not, a lot of stories would never be told. But I think that the key here is, again, if you don't have a response, you have to report that you don't have a response, and then I think you owe it to your readers or viewers to think, well, why are we not getting a response? Is it just, we're pushing a deadline and it's not reasonable for the person to get back to us? In which case, there's this wonderful invention, the digital world, the internet. It's possible to do updates to stories almost instantaneously, and when you've got more information, I think you have an obligation to provide it.
Thank you. Next question. We'll go here, and then we'll come up here.
I'm Sheila Regan. I'm a freelance journalist. And this is actually a question for you, Jonathan, and for SBJ. My question is, with the letter that SBJ wrote, it was very much pointed at KSTP. And I think the danger of that kind of pointing, if you'll excuse that, is that it absolves other media publications of similar, if not as extreme, media biases and racial biases. So I wonder what SBJ is doing to continue conversations about diverse newsrooms, about biases, and about nurturing relationships with communities of color.
I think that's a really important question that you ask. And one of the things as a board and as officers of the board, as we were discussing this issue, was what could we do to move this conversation forward, not just wag our fingers, but you're looking at one of the things we wanted to do to move this conversation forward, because you're absolutely correct. This story raises questions about journalism in the Twin Cities, journalism in the United States in general. And I think we would be remiss to ignore those. I think this particular story had spectacular issues that need to be looked at here. But I also think you've heard in some of the questioning that we've done already that we do want to zoom this out to the issues of journalism in general. Specifically, and I don't want to make too much of this because I think there's more to this panel than this issue, but I think you raise an important question. I do want to give you an answer. We hold recruitment fairs regularly, an intern event that Duchesne was on the panel with, and other newsroom leaders to connect young journalists of all backgrounds with potential jobs and internships in the Twin Cities. And we hold programming once a month to once every other month on different topics, some of which is ethics, some of which is diversity, all of which that we hope will help move journalism forward. Because you're right, there are questions that this raises about all of us. And I think that's part of why we're here.
And if I could just interject, I serve on the national board of the Sigma Delta Chi Foundation, which is the charitable arm of SPJ. Diversity, both in terms of diversifying those who cover the news, but also in how they go about covering the news, is one of the central tenets of the national SPJ organization and SDX Foundation. There are a lot of initiatives that we have going, and if you visit the website, you can learn a lot more about that. So I absolutely agree with what you said, and I can only say that that's something that the national organization has a really strong commitment to.
Other questions? Up top.
Hi, my name is Rich Neumeister, and I'm just a putz who does a couple things here and there once in a while. And I basically am disappointed in the news media in not following up on the Pointergate issue. There's a lot of who, what, where, when, why type questions. Particularly, again, you take a look at history. We had...
Rich, I'm going to ask for a question here.
It is a question. I mean,
okay.
There is some context, too.
Sure.
We had GangNet, 16,000 people, less than 4 years ago. A large number of folks were people of color. You know, there's a lot of social monitoring surveillance within law enforcement, particularly within Minneapolis and some of the bigger cities. So how has the picture gotten out? How is it being pushed by Delmonico? There are a lot of important questions that I'm just greatly disappointed that the news media hasn't picked up on, and they're very much aware of those kind of stories, I think, to follow through. Can you tell me a little bit, I mean, why all of a sudden we're not following up on other things that are related to it that I think can bring a bigger picture out there of what's happening?
Okay. Duchesne, I guess you're going to have to field this one.
I'll take a stab at it. I mean, I think there are a bunch of stories that we should be covering that we're not covering for a whole host of reasons, some of which we're not aware, some of which we don't think they're as important as you might, some of which you might think we've covered sufficiently for now. You started off asking why this is getting so much attention and these other things aren't. This is getting attention because I think a number of us were just so struck by how off the mark this story was and just troubled that it was passing for journalism because it reflects badly on our profession and reverberates negatively throughout our community. And while the other stories you've mentioned are not of value, they certainly are. I think some of our organizations have written about them. There's more to come, but they're not tonight's topic. They're not the story of the day.
I agree with tonight's topic. I agree with you. Your thing is important, but I think there's more of a broader context of why Neville was brought into the system or why he was pointed out. That, I think, is a story itself, so it doesn't happen.
Okay. Thanks, Rich. I appreciate it. Who else has questions in the audience? We've got a question here, and we've got one down here. So, Chris, do you want to come down here first? Yeah. And then, Anna, do you want to come down here? And then we'll come back up.
Hi, I'm Drew Higgins. I'm the editor-in-chief of Carleton College's student newspaper. And I'm curious on how you think the social media has played a role in shaping this issue. The president of Smith College recently expressed discomfort about the role social media plays here, and often what she called Twitter and Facebook the proverbial echo chambers, where we hear our opinions reaffirmed but not challenged. And I wonder if if at any point social media has shaped this issue and misrepresented it. Obviously, KSTP misrepresented the issue, but has some of the feedback also shaped this into something that it's not?
Anthony, why don't you start, since one of the things you mentioned earlier was about how you've used social media to try and get your voice out.
I don't know if this will answer the question, but I want to give a little context for how the story took shape in social media. So within hours before the piece was released, and this speaks back to the interesting story about the organizing that took place at NOC with the folks involved. There was a whole pushback because we've experienced this sort of thing, not this egregious, but in many different arenas because we do racial justice work. There was a whole plan about how we were going to respond with our own narrative. One of those involved the hashtag Pointergate. We had just come out of something called Hot Dog Gate earlier, where there was police sent to the office because we were handing out free hot dogs. So that was the thing, and that got a certain amount of media attention. So this was round 2 of that. So Pointergate became a hashtag. Some of the photos that Wintana, who's at the very top and is a NOC staffer, immediately sent some photos to me that were of Bill Clinton and somebody else pointing at each other. There were 2 or 3 photos that the moment I saw them, I said, all right, this is great. We have a hashtag. We've added some humor by making this visually as nonsensically as it actually is in real life. And so if they decide to run it, here's a list that we sent to the board and all of our core folks and said, this is the pushback. This is the context. Here's the email from Jay Coles. If they run it, this is the pushback.
So let me pin you down, which is you do not feel that social media has distorted this issue.
I think social media has allowed people to weigh in from where they're at in their personal orientation in life and make a decision about how they felt about this particular issue, and the overwhelming response from people who were everybody from celebrities to organizers to journalists and soccer moms all had a pretty strong reaction. It was all very similar.
Okay. Jane, do you think social media has distorted this issue from what it was originally?
Well, I think it depends on how you define social media. It's the same issue that 20 years ago we were saying, how do you define the news media? Social media is not a monolith. It's even less of a monolith than the mainstream media are. So I think inevitably, when there is this much crowdsourcing going on and this many kinds of people weighing in with their viewpoints, some of it is going to be less straightforward than others. Everyone is not a person of goodwill in situations like this. I mean, let's be fair about it. Many people are, but everybody isn't. And some people have an agenda, and you don't have the kind of fact-checking process that a conventional news organization typically would go through before you start tweeting, for example. That doesn't mean it's not spontaneous, it doesn't mean it's not heartfelt, but there is a risk that some of it's not going to be accurate. So in that frenzy, it's possible that inaccurate information will get out there. I think the view tends to be, well, the bad stuff will get challenged along the way and that will eliminate it, but the fact is it never is eliminated. It's still out there somewhere. So I'm not quite as sanguine about kind of the salutary effects of social media as being the wonder cure-all for inaccuracies in the media. But on the other hand, I think that it is a very useful way for the general public to be able to weigh in a way that was never possible before.
Okay, so we'll come down here. I think, Novelle, did you raise your question? You had a question? The gentleman at the center of the issue, I suppose, will have his question next.
How y'all doing? I'm Novelle. I don't know how y'all gonna answer this. How can a known gang member go door from door and be the #1 canvasser for 2 years in a row, trying to get more people involved and engaged in the community? I just want to know that.
Well, I suspect that question is going to be mostly rhetorical for the panel, but I do think it raises an interesting question, which is about how journalists view people in transition. I heard earlier mentions about the issues of reentry and get out the vote and poverty. And I guess the question I'll try and take your question and turn it to one I think the panel can answer and say is how can journalists do better jobs with telling those nuanced stories of people who may have a checkered past, but who are doing different things now. And Duchesne, I'll start with you.
No, we absolutely have to, in our society, in our news pages and on our air, have to capture that transition that people go through. And there are any number of things, whether you're going back to, swiping a candy bar in 5th grade or doing something later in life, any number of things that we've done that we might be proud of, that maybe we reflect on, that we would do differently today. And the same is true of plenty of people who look like me who will have a much harder time transitioning back into healthy roles in society if we don't give them a chance to do so. So as a journalist, certainly that, in my mind, is a great story, actually, looking at someone who, some months or years ago was going down this road and is, for whatever reason, maybe it's maturity, maybe it's having the right people in his or her life, has made some other choices. And in my mind, that's something you want to celebrate and support and encourage, and hopefully not just get that one person to make better choices going forward, but also send a message to people in similar straits that, there's a path back, there are opportunities to live healthy, safe, productive lives in our community, even if you've at times done things that maybe you're not so proud of. And it's not even a race issue at the core. I mean, I think there are racial elements to it in our society, but there are a lot of people who make mistakes in our society, and we have to have a way of giving them opportunities to get back on track and stay on track.
Okay.
I would just add, if I could, that I think part of the problem is that this kind of issue that you're talking about can't be reduced to 140 characters in a tweet. This is a much more nuanced topic, and I think that ultimately, as our society has grown so polarized, readers, viewers, and others are looking for really simplistic ways to address issues like these. They want there to be a single narrative that describes what somebody's path is, from crime to redemption or whatever the case might be. Reality isn't like that. I mean, the discussion that's going on right now about the Rolling Stone story about the alleged gang rape is, to me, another example of where people are being compartmentalized and they're not allowed to just simply be human beings. So I think one of the challenges for the news media today in addressing these very complicated issues is to be prepared to grapple with them and not just accept, a story because it either reinforces an image you already have or contradicts an image you already have or is the conventional wisdom. You've got to really work at them. These are not easy stories to tell in an ethical way and to tell well.
Great point. We've got a question down here, and then I know there's 2 gentlemen up on that aisle who've had their hands up. So,
on the relationships and the interaction between journalists and the police, especially in the Twin Cities, it wasn't that long ago, in the aftermath of the Republican National Convention and the Amy Goodman lawsuit, there should have been some training and some new practices from the police. How does this, KSTP relying so much on a police authority as the origination of the story, is there something about the police that hasn't been corrected since then, or is this, and how has this journalist scrutiny of the police bringing this kind of story forward changed after that and those court-ordered reforms?
Duchesne, on the very real ground level, do you see a change in relationships with police since the RNC?
I don't know. I think that, I don't think that this story is reflective. That's part of why I'm here. I don't think this story is reflective of local media. I don't think it's representative of the kind of journalism that we seek to practice, and I don't think it's the case at other outlets in town. Other people looked at this story and said it was not a story for them, and they moved on and did other things with their time. Obviously, and this is not new, right? There are plenty of people who have agendas, who have their own opinions of whether it's the mayor or folks like Novell and their views of him from a distance. When you're a journalist, you're charged with listening to people and then deciding if there's a story there for you, and really more importantly, a story there for your community. And so I don't know that this story is terribly instructive about the larger relationship there between the media and the police. I think it's a one-off that is out there, and you can't put it back in the box.
Jane, I know this is an issue that you think a lot about. You mentioned it earlier. Is there anything else you want to add to that need for a questioning relationship between journalism and law enforcement?
I think the invocation of the RNC experience is an important thing to remind us about. SPJ actually sponsored a forum on that topic shortly after the convention to bring these kinds of issues forward. I think there's a lot of skepticism in this community, not just among the press, but among other members of the community about the kind of activities that police are engaging in. You know, the current push to require body cams, for example, is an example of the concerns that the public has about the conduct of the police. On the other hand, you know, they are an instrumentality of government. There's something that the press has to cover, and it's always going to be a tricky relationship between the media and the police. That's just the nature of the business, just as it's tricky for journalists to cover the courts, because journalists typically do things that drive judges crazy, and yet they still have to uphold their First Amendment rights. So it's never a comfortable relationship. That's the nature of the way our free society operates. So a little tension is certainly understandable, but I think vigilance on the part of the press is absolutely essential. You can never take anything for granted.
Thank you.
Hey, I've got a quick question, which is, you know, just a quick quote from the Hubbard letter that I'd really be interested to hear your reaction to, which was that Hubbard said, "We were aware that there was friction between the mayor, the chief of police, and the POFM, but we determined that should not deter our reporting on what we were told by multiple credible sources was an incident that had the potential for jeopardizing public safety." And what do you think about that?
What's PFLF?
I was going to say POFM is the police officers. It's the police officers union.
It's the union.
Yeah, the police union. I can't remember what the F and the M stand for, but it's the police officers union. So.
Well, I guess my initial reaction to that when I read it the first time and now when you reread it is that, you know, invoking public safety, whether it's the federal government talking about national security or whether it's the local law enforcement talking about public safety, is the easiest thing for people in law enforcement and the intelligence community to do. Why is it the easiest thing for them to do? Because it's the hardest thing for you to check out. When we're talking about national security, they classify everything. When we're talking about what the cops are doing, they'll tell you it's exempt under the Data Practices Act. So it's very hard to independently confirm what it is that they're saying. So you're left with saying, you know, trust us. We're the government. We're here to help you, and you're supposed to just believe that. So I take Mr. Hubbard's point that when somebody tells you public safety is in jeopardy and you're a journalist, you need to take that seriously. But again, the line of the inquiry should not end there. That's my point. I'm not saying you assume they're all lying. I'm saying you approach it with a certain degree of skepticism.
Duchesne, did you want to respond to that at all?
Yeah, you know, she was pointing, right? And I think we could spend a lot of time making this a much bigger deal, but she was pointing. And if they asked her if what she was doing, and she said she was pointing, and they still went ahead with a story that suggested that she knew she was throwing up a gang sign. That's what we're here about. She was pointing.
Up here, gentleman who's had his hand up for a while.
Yes, my name is Bill Dooley. I'm just a citizen and bicycle advocate, I guess. But my problem with the whole thing is that there's so many negative images of African Americans in the news in general. As a matter of fact, I don't even watch television news. I get all of my news through the newspapers. I think television news is just terrible. There's no prevailing positive stories about African Americans. So I think KSTP felt obligated to run that story because it just runs in with all the other negative stories about African Americans that are on TV every night. So they say, well, we're just going to go with it. So my question for all of you recruiters is that are you selling the notion that if you come into a market like this as a minority journalist, not only are you able to check what goes on in the newsroom, to edit what goes on in the newsroom, but that you can actually go out and do some positive stories so that we can get these positive stories out and counteract all of this negative stuff that comes through the airways on a daily basis.
Okay, let me break that question into two parts because I think there's two questions there. And Anthony, let me throw the first one at you, which is, do you see positive stories about minority communities in our media in this community?
Well, first of all, hey, Bill Dooley, I get your emails, and I don't always respond, but you send some great updates, so keep them coming. Again, there's a range. I agree with much of what Bill said. There's just, our first reaction was when we knew this story was being framed. It's not the first example. It's one of the most egregious examples, but it's totally true that we are constantly fighting a narrative battle in the work that we do. So I don't know if that answers your question. I agree with it. We've chosen to sort of combat that by creating our own stories, and in fact, Pointergate is a perfect example of that. We had our own video that went viral almost simultaneously to the tweets that told the accurate story. I think that's part of what propelled the story forward. It since has probably close to 500,000 views, 400,000 views on YouTube. And it's the accurate story because we knew we had to document the real story and not rely on the media. In fact, didn't call media on that particular day. We knew that there was enough political ammunition with the mayor, the chief of police in North Minneapolis with black staff that there's all sorts of ways the media can get that wrong. So we didn't invite media for that reason. So I agree with you, and there's lots of examples of folks who NPR has done some great stuff by coming into the office, sitting with Novell, and really, getting to the core and the guts of what the story is about. Again, Soul Tools Radio, Uptake, even Sheila Reagan has done some stuff with us in the past, where there's ways to get it right, and there are folks that have gotten it right, but it takes an intentional, deliberate effort on the part of folks that, frankly, oftentimes journalists don't have the time or don't have the interest in doing the work to get it right.
Jane, let me turn to you and ask you the broader question about TV news. Is it all crap? Is there good TV news out there?
Well, I guess I have to confess that I've been interviewed on KSTP. I've been interviewed on all the local television stations, and the reason I was late was because I was off doing something for MSNBC. So I'm not going to, say all broadcast journalism and all cable journalism is a waste of time, and you shouldn't be expending any energy with it. But I'm going to go back to something I said about the Minnesota News Council and voluntary codes of ethics and things like that. It's often seemed to me that one of the problems with broadcast journalism, and it's kind of counterintuitive, is that because broadcasters are regulated by the Federal Communications Commission, there's a tendency among some broadcast journalists, and they've said this to me, I'm not just imagining this or making it up, that if the FCC doesn't tell them that something is wrong to do, it must be okay to do it. And I mean, yeah, it's as odd as that might seem. And of course, the Federal Communications Commission is very limited under both the Constitution but also under federal statute about what it can actually regulate. It's not supposed to muck around with what journalists do when they're delivering news. It's supposed to get out of the way and let them do their work. So except in some limited circumstances like staging and fabricating news, they really can't do anything about it. So what that means is that broadcast journalists, just like any other journalists, need to have their own standards and codes of ethics. But I think sometimes, although broadcast entities will have their big standards book that the network sends down to them, a lot of that deals more with things that are important, like conflicts of interest, but are less willing to grapple with these really kind of fundamental issues about how you cover your community in a way that really does celebrate the diversity of the community.
Duchesne, the recruiting question goes to you as the Star Tribune's recruiter. How are you selling the Twin Cities on journalists of color or journalists who represent minority communities that you want to bring here?
That it's a great place to live and work, and that they have a chance to help shape our community's understanding of itself over time. So what do we do professionally? We go out into the community, we interview people, we take their photos, sometimes we shoot video of them, and we reflect that back out to the broader community. And so having not just people of color, but also white folks, obviously, who kind of get the importance of that and get the trust that's there, and get at times that those are very complicated stories. They need to be treated with care. Having the right mindset and commitment to do those kinds of stories, those more complicated stories, in a thorough, thoughtful way is what we're working toward. Doesn't mean we get it right with every story. I think we get it increasingly right over time. I think we're doing a better job than we were doing 20 years ago when I first got here. I don't think we're perfect, but I do think journalists of all stripes in our newsroom care about these issues. And the challenge here with, and it's not just a race issue, though I recognize that there are implications for communities of color, is that, we don't write stories about white people who get up, hold down a job, go home, flip on the TV and watch Monday Night Football. That's not news, right? News is at the extremes. And sadly, too much of, when we're talking about crime and violence and the disparities in our society, too much of that lives in Black and Latino and some Asian communities. And that's an American dilemma. It doesn't absolve us of any responsibility to try and put those stories in a larger context. Doesn't mean we shouldn't actively work to find stories that run against that grain, because there are a lot of people of color doing great things in this community every day. We could tell more of those stories. We do tell them. We don't tell them often enough. But the bottom line is that news is mostly, whether it's television news or the front page of my paper tomorrow, something we want to get your attention about. And sometimes it's really good news, but oftentimes it's something we think you need to know about that needs to be fixed. And sometimes it's crime, sometimes it's politics, sometimes it's the environment, lots of stuff. But it isn't mostly, some great thing that happened today, right? It just isn't that. And the truth of the matter is, when we look at, and there's a high correlation there between both race and poverty, obviously. Anthony touched on some of the disparity issues already. A lot of the stuff that we're struggling with most as a society plays out in communities of color. And I think we have the resources here. Unlike many other communities, we don't necessarily have the wherewithal, the commitment to address it day in, day out. But we've got, when you look at the challenges that exist in this community relative to the resources, we have a real potential here to move the needle in Twin Cities. And this is a place that has a lot of hard work to do, and I think journalists have a role to play in doing it.
Down here.
Yeah, Nick Halter from the Business Journal. This is for Anthony. There's been some evidence as recently as maybe a week ago that Jay Coles is still kind of digging around for some information on mayor's staff. I don't know. What's your correspondence been with him in the last week or two? Is he still pursuing a story? Is KSTP still pursuing a story? I guess what I'm getting at is this story dead, or are we going to see more from KSTP in the future?
Yeah, I can't speak for them, but I can say we'd like to move on with our lives. I think we can concretely say that, and they keep digging in. J. Cole's just the other day, we were passed along the fact that an ally of ours refused to be covered by J. Cole's on KSTP. They wanted to do a story on this particular guy and his sort of community work. He was a white guy. And he declined and said, I'm not going to be associated until you all apologize. We didn't even know him personally, but until you apologize for that piece, I'm going to respectfully decline coverage. J. Coles then sent an email back, again, defending all of the things that he had done and said, referencing there's more to come. He's still in this place of there's still more stuff out there that just hasn't surfaced, and I'll be vindicated one day. So he's not responding to us. He's not called us or reached out in any way, shape, or form. Neither has KSTP. We'd be happy to talk to them just to make it public. We have nothing to hide. Anytime they want to reach out to us and sit down, Mr. Hubbard or J. Cole's included, we're happy to do that. But there is evidence that they are still telling the story to themselves, that they are in the right and the rest of the world is wrong.
Let's go up here. Second row from the top.
Hello, my name is Patrick File. I'm a visiting faculty fellow at the U of M School of Journalism and Mass Communication, affiliated with the Silha Center. I had another social media question, and sort of, I think, one with a little bit of a finer point on it, and also, I think, somewhat in reference to Jay Coles, a reporter on this particular story. Sort of shortly after the story aired initially, and then there was some backlash on Twitter, some of it directed to him on Twitter, he began responding to some of that criticism directly. And I think that ceased pretty quickly after that, but I mean, I think there were a good few hours that went on. And I'm curious, sort of, again, really purely from, initially at least from a practical standpoint, from maybe a newsroom leadership standpoint, maybe Jonathan and Duchesne, what your kind of responses are to that, and sort of what your thoughts about that might be. And I don't know if you sort of saw specifically what went on there. And then maybe sort of from the standpoint of somebody who was kind of leading a social media response, what your thoughts about that, Anthony, might be, just sort of, and just generally kind of what your kind of thoughts overall about sort of that sort of means of response and sort of the, in the brave new world of Twitter, I suppose, kind of how you felt about that.
Okay. Duchesne, what do you tell your journalists about responding to criticism on Twitter?
I think it's fine to respond, but you want to be thoughtful. You want to avoid being defensive, and to really make sure you're listening to people. Sometimes people, I'll tell you, sometimes people reach out to us and their framing of our story is off base. Their facts are wrong, or they're ascribing motive that isn't there. And I think it's fine to have, and healthy, not just fine, but healthy, to have that conversation. I think there can be a problem actually in just saying, I'm too important to even respond to you. So I think silence isn't necessarily the right answer, but, and I didn't see Jay's response. It's funny to the question you asked her, I did not spend a lot of time looking at the social media reaction to this story. I didn't need to. I looked at it for myself and thought, this is not good journalism. I didn't need other people's response to it to drive me in one direction or another. So I don't know what Jay specifically said, though I imagine that he defended it, and that's not surprising. They've defended it through a second story and through Mr. Hubbard's response to us. And it's just too bad. I mean, they do good work in this community. This story is not an example of it. And I think that the healthiest response would have been having it get out there. It's already out. The best response would have been for someone to kill that story before it ran. That being said, for them to take the feedback they're getting from so many different quarters and reflect on what the value of the story was to the community, and that's yet to come.
You asked me, and I'll be brief and just say that we tell our reporters to respond thoughtfully and not defensively, but to have a dialogue with your audience about criticisms of your stories and to internalize those criticisms, because if there are enough responses, often there is someone who's going to at least give you something to think about. I saw some of J. Call's responses. I'm not his editor. I don't want to pass judgment on him individually, at least for that. But I think it's important for journalists, like Duchesne said, to not think that they're above questioning. We heard some, at SPJ, at MNSPJ, we heard some critical comments about our statement. And we shared them with the board, and my comments to the board was, if we want people to take our statement and our criticism seriously, we should take their comments and their criticism very seriously. And I think that lesson applies to journalists as well, which is if we want our stories to be taken seriously, we need to take the public seriously as well.
Can I just interject that as somebody who has represented the media as a lawyer, I have to say that my experience is that the journalist who has written the story is probably going to be, without doubt, the most offensive about the story. That's just human nature. Journalists as a group are very, very thin-skinned. They invest themselves in their stories. They work very hard on their stories. They're usually proud of the work they do, and they really don't like to be criticized. So I think that, while, again, social media and even just digital publishing has made that whole process much more interactive than it used to be, and in some respects that's good, the fundamental human nature has not changed. And I think for most reporters, if I were an editor in that situation, I would be encouraging them to take a beat or two or three or four before they respond to that angry tweet, because it's just, again, human nature. It takes a really very strong, very mature, very detached person to be able to respond in a disinterested way to something that's attacking your integrity, which is really what this is about. I mean, we're kind of condemning J. Coles and KSTP here, and I don't really want to take that position full stop. I just want to say that I think it's absolutely fair to criticize, but it's also important to bear in mind we're dealing with human beings here, and human beings are fallible.
So, Anthony, go ahead.
Yeah, so I can condemn them a little bit for this particular piece. And here's why with regards to the tweets. In case folks don't know, J. Cole's spent some time responding to the tidal wave of public opinion. One or maybe two of those tweets doubled down on the fact that Novell is a gang member publicly. So when I mention that this is actually a form of violence, I want to explain what that does to somebody in Novell's position who's going door to door in North Minneapolis. When the allegation publicly that he's a gang member is made without any evidence, we can no longer send Novell Gordon to do his job, of which he's very, very skilled at, going door to door to have community conversations, because I don't know who read that. We don't know. He's referenced others, particular gangs in those tweets, the Stick Up Boys, who are an actual gang. And he's saying that he's either a member, it was unclear with the tweets. It was so reckless that it wasn't even clear if he's part of that gang or a rival gang. But in any case, we can't send Novell now to go door to door to do his work. They've taken away his ability to do the job that he was exceptionally good at. We're going to find another type of work for him to do. But I don't think it's actually just something to gloss over. I think it's a deliberate act. And again, I want to say this with all due respect to KSTP and folks in the audience. But this is the way that white supremacy and systemic racism works. It doesn't have to be thoughtful and deliberate about the communities that it affects and it impacts. It has the ability just to do stuff that it thinks is right in the moment without having to acknowledge the consequences. And by the way, we don't have that right in the work that we do. And Becky and Novell, Dennis, Wintana can tell you every piece of messaging that goes out, even though we don't always get it right, is looked at by multiple people, multiple eyes to consider the context, the content, is it accurate, who it might offend, because we're living in a world where we have to be cautious. We live with other people in other communities. To think that he doesn't have to do that and KSTP doesn't have to do that, I don't know why they're held to a different standard.
I don't know that we should say that KSTP doesn't review their content. I mean, I think they have editors and producers who make news decisions every day, and I think
if I could just respond to this,
sure,
because this is important. I'm not a journalist, so I'm in slightly different territory.
Yeah.
But we talked to the editor in advance of the story and gave them a heads up and said, please do your homework on this particular story and this particular person. We know the story. We have it documented. And if you're going to release the story that we think you are, do your homework. So I just want to push back on this notion that this was a whimsical error on the part of a news station. It actually was a deliberate set of actions, not one action, a deliberate set of actions that had a deep impact on the individuals involved in the broader community.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question, and we'll go down front here.
Okay. I was wondering, when you say these sound bites come on TV and we see these different things go around, and
can you introduce yourself real quick?
My name is Dennis.
Dennis.
With these sound bites you see on TV and the things going around, and even though you ask questions, when you, as a journalist, you hear from the police, and you think this is a reputable situation, how do you say, oh, I can't listen to the police now, I'm just going to throw that out the window and not go with the story? I mean, every day we hear these things go on in our community. You say even they're going to 11, 13 people got arrested, has nothing to do with the story, but they want to narrate it together. You know, we're not knowing what that gang was about. Why they got arrested? Well, who shot John Anthony? But how is that story related to this story and all stories that have to do with any kind of gang situation always related to something else that has nothing to do with that?
So
why do media always pose?
Your question is about context.
Exactly. How, you know, and then you come in, you put this in a cart. A department by itself. The union has nothing to do with this. The union is the one who brought this up. KSTP was the one who reported it. How did KSTP get this information? No one knows that this guy was a felon or whatever he was until the police brought this to somebody's attention.
I appreciate that. So the question you want the panel to answer is about context of the story. Is that fair? How does media decide what stories are related to each other?
Exactly. How do they coin
All
these
right.
things together?
Let's take that question, which is Duchesne, I guess.
Well, I think you do ask
story.
questions, right? And so they did. They said they spoke to 8 different sources, law enforcement sources, not counting the mayor's office, and that would not, those 8 on their own, in my mind, on our story, if what you look at when you see the pose of Novell and the mayor is two people who are pointing. And if you call the mayor's office and they say, yeah, she was just pointing. I said it kind of tongue-in-cheek earlier, but I think if their response was, okay, she's really down with the XYZ gang and, you know, they're going to take over the city, that's a hell of a story. That's not what they said. They said she's pointing, which I think is what most of us would see in looking at the photo of the two of them. And so that's why I was saying in this instance, I don't see how the story advanced. I don't think there's a story there unless they can demonstrate that someone can demonstrate that she knowingly flashed a gang sign. The fact that she's with someone who they don't think she should be with, for whatever reason, is in and of itself a story. That doesn't make sense to me. Is the mayor supposed to know or care about any potential criminal history that Novell might have had if he's out knocking on doors? It just falls apart. And so I think we do talk to multiple sources, and in this case, they got the response from the mayor's office that there was nothing going on there but pointing, and they still ran with it. They had the information they had the information I would have needed to know there wasn't a story there.
Okay. I know there are a couple more questions, but I said last question. I want to respect that. I hope you'll all join me in giving a round of applause to our panelists. I want to thank you all here in the room and on the live stream for tuning in. I think we had a really thoughtful discussion here. I'll stick around for a few minutes if there are follow-up questions. Maybe a couple of our panelists can, if you have one-on-one. But I want to thank you all for coming out. Remind you that our website is mnspj.org, and I hope you will visit us and consider some of our future programming on other topics. Thank you all.